All right. Good morning, good lunch, whatever. Hope you enjoyed the party last night. I sure did. And I actually have 2 drinking tickets for sale, if anyone is interested. Might be useless, but it could be a sort of souvenir from the NIC conference. We are here for the final day before lunch. And we will learn about deployment using ConfigMgr 012. So tips and tricks to make your life a little bit easier when it comes to deploying primarily Windows 7 with ConfigMgr. Most of what I say will also be valid for servers and for even XP or legacy clients, but the focus is 7 and ConfigMgr. My name is Johan. I'm a Microsoft MVP in setup and deployment, and I work as a consultant, a small consulting company in Stockholm, and I spend my days traveling around the globe, at least half of it, implementing or fixing deployment solutions for various organizations and customers. And I'm basically here to share some of those experiences, notes from the field, with you today. I love questions, so at any given time, feel free to just raise your hand. I have a little bit problem seeing the back rows there. There's a light here. But just yell out and I will be happy to answer the question. If you have any questions after, feel free to shoot me an email, contact me on Twitter, find my blog, whatever. I might not have seen everything when it comes to deployment, but I've seen a lot. So rather than you guys banging the head against the wall for hours or days, if you have a problem, try shooting an email. I'm pretty good responding. All right. Up for the next 58 or 59 minutes or so is basically a few distinct areas where I've seen customers struggling with OSD, and we will address them as we go along. So first of all, I have a demo environment up and running. This is what we'll be using throughout every demo. A few domain controllers. I'm quite proud of convincing my manager to buy me this laptop. It's a 1.2 terabyte solid state drive array in it, and a lot of memory. My next challenge is to convince him to upgrade to 32, because there actually are 4 slots in it, so I could. But the 8 gig modules are somewhat expensive right now. The main config managed server is CMO4. CMO1 is just a 07 server that I'm going to use for migration demos and such, but that's not for today. So CMO4 and the domain controllers is what we will be using. And as you can see, I'm running RC1 of ConfigMgr. I'm running on SQL 2008, R2 SP1 CU4, which is the minimal requirement if you want to run R2. If you run 2008 SP2, you need to have at least CU6, commit update 6 in order to run it. So, from an OSD perspective, what you need to have in ConfigMgr is basically software distribution working. The key word is working. Because if you cannot deploy XML Notepad or Adobe Reader, small applications, packages, trust me, it won't help by you adding a 4 or 5 gig package to it. So get the small thing working first, and then get going. In order to do Windows 7 deployments, WIKE version 2 is required, and that's part of the RC1 release of ConfigMgr 012. Also, something I do recommend, it's not required, it's to integrate with the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit as well. And I will come back to later why I think this is a good idea for you. So, shorthand story. How many of you are using OSD with ConfigMgr 07 today? I would say most of the room, at least 60%. You're in for a treat because there is that much change in 012 when it comes to OSD. So if you learn to master it in 07, you just need to master the new console. That's a challenge though, but you don't need to relearn OSD. That's my point. So, but there are a few new features related to OSD in ConfigMgr 012. For example, directly on our images on the server, we can apply patches offline. We do not have to do a build and capture, which is probably what you guys are doing today. You can still do that, but you don't have to anymore. Also, the boot media has changed a little bit. In 07, I was in Austin, Texas this summer for a week. Was working with Dell there. And I spent the week in their lab, fortunately, because outside it was well over 40 degrees every single day that week. They have 80 primary sites, meaning they have 80 boot images. Because in 07, every single primary site, well, needs its own boot image, unless you trick it a little bit. But by default, that's it. That's how you do it. They are quite happy now that we can have a single boot image that is hierarchy-wide that will span through all sites. So they are now reducing those 80 sites to 3. One for reporting, one for a primary deployment, and one for their development department. That's it. Because ConfigMgr 012 allows you to flatten the hierarchy quite a bit, reducing those number of sites. And from a boot media perspective, that's good too. Also in 07, if you cranked open the boot image, there was an ini file in it, named tsmbootstrap.ini. If you added unattended equals true in that file, even when you booted from a CD, the wizard went away. Otherwise, when you booted from a CD or USB stick, there was a small welcome wizard. Hi and welcome to ConfigMgr, please click next. And customers didn't like that. But hacking that file was unsupported in 07. Now it's in the UI. Now it's in the properties of the boot image. So you tick that checkbox, and what you think ConfigMgr will do? Yep, update that file in the boot image. So now it is supported. Also in 07, there was no real built-in way of selecting or pre-selecting sequences when you started a boot image. Of course, you could do a mandatory advertisement, sure, but there was no built-in UI to select a sequence that you wanted to have. Now there is a variable that you can set, so you can have a script figuring out what sequence you want to use depending on what hardware you're deploying to, what site you belong to, or things like that. And then you can pre-select that sequence and it will be used without having to force it to do a mandatory advertisement in that previous sense. Also, the PXE service point is gone. It's now a setting on the distribution point itself. That also means that normally you would troubleshoot it by diving into the SMS PXE log file back in the days, in 07. Now, since it's a part of a DP, what log file do you go to? Yeah, the distribution manager log file, this manager log. That's where you find the information. Microsoft also removed the limit. I'm sure most of you run into that you could only have 75 PXE service points per site, right? Very common issue to run into. No, not really. They removed that limit anyway. They haven't published the number yet of how high you can go. They just say more than 75. So it could possibly be 76. I don't know. So let us take a quick preview on the OSD features in ConfigMgr. What's changed? And I don't do that for my Windows 7 client, though. It helps if you go to the ConfigMgr server. The first thing I talked about was patches. The software update point in ConfigMgr 012 is very nice. It's more like a WSUS server nowadays than a software update point, which is good. So we have all the auto approval processes and ease of creating packages and such. But if I go to an image that I have a 64-bit Windows 7 image here. I can right-click that image, and I can select, let me just start Zoomit here. Zoomit, by the way, is the utility that allows me to do this. so that people in the back row can see as well. This boot image, if you right-click it, there is a schedule updates right here. If you have deployed, and the keyword is deployed, any updates already, you can now schedule updates directly from here. So you can select all the updates, you can filter them, and you can schedule them for like 10 p.m. tonight, or a few minutes away from now if you want to. And then the image will be patched offline. So that's a neat feature. If you look at the boot images, this is my 32-bit boot image that I use for most things. There is a brand new customization tab in it, where we can configure various settings related to deployment and what the files want to be and the background image that we want to have, etc. We have our drivers if we want to add them, and we configure it here for how we want to deploy this boot image. By default, every single boot image that you have will not boot from a PXE, even if you go into the distribution point and enable PXE. You actually have to go to the boot image itself and tick this checkbox down here. Otherwise, it will not PXE boot. All right. So the distribution point itself is in the administration tab, distribution points. There's my only distribution point, properties. This is where you have the PXE. This is where you enable it. And please be aware, this feature right here is normally what I would use, but in the RC1, it's a little bit buggy. So if you want to have a sort of a solid test environment for PXE, don't check this box. It's in the release notes. You do read the release notes, do you? Yeah, figured. So you check this one, and you wait, and you watch the dist manager log file. Then you go back to the boot image, and you tick that one, and you watch the dist manager log file. And then what you do is you go to the remote install folder, and you start to look for files. You start to look for files in the 32-bit folder, and you start to look for files in the 64-bit folder. If there are no files, PXE boot will not work. This is the most common reason I get an email from someone, well, I press F12 and nothing happens. It just stalls there. Yeah, these files are missing. Try again. All right. I did mention I loved questions. I did, yeah. So, the site server requirement nowadays is 2008. It requires 64-bit hosts, 64-bit operating systems, and 64-bit SQL. But the DPs, the distribution points, doesn't have to be. They could still be 2003. But I don't recommend that. I do recommend you to actually run your DPs on 2008, because the performance increase is big. When we do OS deployment, there is quite much file copying going on over the network. And the 2008 server is much more efficient to do that than any other 2003 server is. On a LAN, you will get at least twice the speed. At least twice. On a WAN, say you have a remote distribution point, you get at least 3.5 times the speed. That's not percent, that's a factor 3.5. Just by upgrading the OS on your DPs. And also now, since we have a server DP, you could still have a client. You can have a Windows 7 machine being a DP, but you're missing two things then. What are you missing if you try to run a client as a distribution point? Yeah, PXE, right? And Multicast. You don't get Multicast from a Windows 7 client, and you certainly don't get PXE unless you do some really dirty tricks and implement third-party PXE servers and hack the boot image from ConfigMgr, of which both those scenarios are not supported. Works, but it's not supported. So, Multicast will give you I wouldn't necessarily say performance, even though I wrote performance here. I would say efficiency. Because a Windows 7 image today is often 4 or 5 gigs in size. And if I deploy that to, say, 20 machines at the same time with ConfigMgr, it will take me about 41 minutes or so in a good network. How long time will it take if I actually enable multicast on my DP? Any guesses? Less? More? I would say about the same, about 41 minutes. Most of the time, you don't get that much difference if you only deploy 20 machines. If you would deploy 100, oh yeah, big difference. But if you look at the network load, that's where you have the difference. If you deploy those 20 machine unicast, you can see your switches lighting up as Christmas trees, basically. Overloaded the network, 90-95% load. But if you enable multicast, you may have like a 10 to 15% load. So it doesn't give you speed, it gives you efficiency, and what it gives you is the option of doing deployment daytimes without killing the network. You don't have to wait for after 5 o'clock or weekends to do deployment. You can do it daytime. However, you probably heard me say, if you ever listened to me before, that there is a license cost involved in multicast. And the license cost is different in Sweden than in Norway because of the currency. Because there is involving a dinner in that price. You need to be friends with a networking group. You need to invite them out to a nice dinner. Possibly beer or even stronger things. Because your network needs to be designed for multicast. If it's not, don't even think about using it. It will actually make things worse. So, be friends with the networking group, have them configure the switches to support multicast, and the most important thing of all, it needs to be designed for multicast. What do I mean by design? I mean the following. I mean that I was visiting a customer. They enabled multicast. The switches supported multicast. Everything was just fine until they started to do deployments. Then their wireless network died. And the entire network came to a halt. Because they had their access points for the wireless network on the same VLAN as all their clients. And that wireless network tried at its very best to forward those multicast packages. And the access points didn't like it and they died. So, one VLAN, I can say 0 for sake, or 1. This is where you have your wireless access points. Check. VLAN 2 to how many you have clients on, 22. This is where you have the clients. And this is the VLAN that is configured for multicast, of course. And then you have the final VLAN, which is related to Pixie. Because IP phones also Pixie boot. And an IP phone is going to be pretty upset if you try to feed it with a boot image from ConfigMgr. Now, you know, you can set options to control this, but if you design the network like this, it makes your life much easier. And it makes multicast much easier too. So what do we need to do to enable multicast? 2 checkboxes. Please be aware, in the RC1 release, this is a little bit buggy, the multicast thing. What you may run into is that you have a perfectly working lab with a single DP. You enable multicast, and suddenly you can't deploy anymore. If you look into the log file, you will see found 1 multicast distribution point, check. found 0 normal distribution points. They just went away. So anyway, if you go to the DP, properties, you go multicast, this one here, you select this one here, enable multicast. You can figure the ranges and such, but this is the key enabler. And then you go to your OS image. Da-dum-dum-dum. Go to the package, properties, wait patiently, data source, distribution settings. Take this one to make this package available for multicast. This is something you do for OS image packages or any packages that is downloading in the WinPE phase, meaning not applications, because applications are deployed way later in the running OS. You can still stage them if you have a giant package. If you're deploying AutoCAD to a bunch of machines, sure, you can have a package being staged at the local disk in a local folder using multicast. And then you can have an application that just run the local executable. That's fine. But that's cheating. But it's possible. It's intended for OS images. My recommendation, if you really need those giant packages, well, do create a thick image with it. Have a separate image for that department where you add AutoCAD or whatever things in it, and that will make deployment easier. Otherwise, I normally recommend thin images because they allow me to be flexible at deployment time. The more stuff you pour into an image, the less flexible it will be. The more costly it will be to maintain. All right. This one. I use MDT for two things. I use MDT Light Touch to create my reference images for ConfigMgr. And I do that for a few reasons. One, it's quicker. I shouldn't do that because I work as a consultant and I bill by the hour. So making it quicker means less money back to me. But I do that anyway because I like to spend my time on things that I think it's worth spending time on, not waiting for a progress bar. So I use Light Touch to create the reference images because it gives me speed. It gives me compatibility. The result image, the reference image I get from Light Touch, I can use with any deployment solution on the planet. I can use it with Light Touch, I can use it with Ghost, I can use it with ConfigMgr, I can use it with Altiris, I can use it with my VDI solution, I can use it with VMware, I can use it with anything. Because that image is very, very generic. If you build a reference image in ConfigMgr, well, it's for ConfigMgr, period. Secondly, there are options that you might want to do in the image, like customizing the admin profile, so that that profile during deployment is copied to default user, so that every new user on that machine has a sort of a base set of settings. And that is much easier to configure in Light Touch because we have an admin profile in Light Touch. When we build reference images in ConfigMgr, we don't have one. So we have to fake it, either through an auto logon or by scripting things into the registry. Again, it's easier to do it in Light Touch. And finally, it's way easier to hand off to someone else. The entire solution in Light Touch is a folder. If I want to delegate that process to you, sir, I copy that folder to you. And now you can do it. You don't have to give that person access into the ConfigMgr console. They can still create and manage and maintain and test reference images very more quickly than in ConfigMgr. Time-wise, that you will spend on a normal deployment project is about half. So if it will take you 2 days with Light Touch to create that perfect reference image of yours, it will take you 4 days in ConfigMgr. Simple as that. Then I integrate for my production deployments, I add a zero-touch component of MDT into ConfigMgr. Because that will add about 100 additional OS deployment features on top of ConfigMgr. And the cost of MDT is free. Doesn't cost you anything. But there are 3 of those 100 features that I value the most. And the first one is MDT will enable dynamic deployments to you, meaning you don't have to have 25 sequences just because you won't have different settings on them. You will have a rules engine, a dynamic engine, feeding things into the sequence when you deploy it, so that when you deploy for a specific accounting, specific department, you get 10 applications and this OU. If you deploy it in that site, you get other applications and other settings. If you deploy it back in Sweden, you get the Swedish language. If you deploy it here in Norway, you get the Norwegian language pack. Things like that. Things that normally I see customers creating 5, 10, 15, 20 sequences for. So dynamic deployment you get. You get the database. It's optional, but I recommend using it, where you can store deployment-related settings. ConfigMgr has no real sort of deployment-specific part of its database. Sure, you can do variables on the resource on the collection, sure, but there is no real database specific for deployment. You get that with MDT, so you can have a separate source for everything that is deployment-related. And you can have hundreds and hundreds of settings for every given machine if you want to, or you can have 2. It's up to you. And the third one is you get the development framework for customizing ConfigMgr. I was working with a customer that had spent 4 days writing scripts. They were very proud of these scripts. So I felt bad for a minute about breaking the news to them. But they spent 4 days, a few people, writing scripts to do regional settings. And that's a one-liner when you added the MDT component. And they are supported as well. So if you start to think about writing scripts in ConfigMgr, download MDT first and look what's in there. What you are looking for is probably in there already. Or it's 99% ready or 90% ready. So you just have to do that custom tweak in the end, rather than spending whole 100% doing the changes. So again, it simply allows you to do changes and to configure OS deployment more quickly, more efficient. It's designed to make your life easier. It's designed for simplifying things. And yet the most common reason I hear from customers, they say, no, we don't want to add it. It's adding complexity to our solution. We just want to use plain vanilla ConfigMgr. And that's the same customer who's spending those 4 days, a few people writing scripts. Which is more complex now? Downloaded, supported, documented solution, or developing in-house stuff. Okay. So this is a longer list, what I was talking about. These are basically sort of in the top 8 list of features available, and I will show a few of them to you. All right. When you run the integration, and by the way, I have a session this afternoon where I will, from scratch to finish, build a complete deployment solution. So it's a very long demo. 57 minutes. I timed it. But when you add in, sorry? Was there a question? No. After you integrate MDT, if you go, for example, for your sequences, you will see that up in the ribbon bar, there is a new button. Create MDT sequence. When you create that sequence, you get sort of a quite lengthy wizard. 20 pages or so. But this wizard will help you create all the packages that you need for deployment. And the end result, after running through this wizard, I'm not going to do that, is a long sequence. Very long sequence. But this sequence can do anything. We control this sequence by feeding settings to it. And the settings are being fed either from the database, but always from a single text file. It's called the settings package. This is it. It's a text file. In this text file, I have said that when I deploy my machines, they are supposed to go into that OU. When I migrate my machines, doing a refresh or replace, these are the profiles I will copy, and these are the backup templates I will use to control what data is being carried over. I'm saying I don't want a full backup, and I say I don't want to capture it. I don't do a build and capture here. What if I wanted to deploy 3 standard applications? Well, I could go into my sequence. I can find the install software action. I can say install a single software packages. Or I can even have applications where I can say I would like to have the following applications, and then you add applications from ConfigMgr to it, to creating a list. But as soon as you start doing things in here, they are static. And this is why you have multiple sequences. Instead, I can skip this and just feed it with whatever the name of the app was. It has to match, though. It's a bit picky about, it's not case sensitive, but it's so now I have assigned 2 applications to my deployment, just by changing 2 lines in the text file. The sequence will now read it, figure out, all right, you told me 2 applications were needed, let's go ahead and deploy it when the sequence is deploying applications. Or, to be truthfully with you, it's actually deploying those apps directly after the sequence is finished. It's sort of a preloading them. So they will be available before the user logs in and do its things. It's a little bit different than ConfigMgr 7, but still it's part of the deployment process. Say that you want to have, say that this application is not Adobe Reader anymore. It's the Dell Freefall sensor application. You know, the control panel applet that allow you to enable or disable the freefall sensor on the Dell. That's something you don't want to have on every machine, right? Probably. You want to have it on Dell only. You can add model in here. And you can say for my Dell, it's not Dell, it's Latitude, E6410. It will have the Dell sensor. But I still have Adobe Reader here as my standard app. And now I have just done one dynamic thing. When I deploy to such hardware, it will get 3 applications. To everybody else, only 2. And yet, you could do this in the sequence as well. You can add the application in the sequence. You can set a condition on it. But this is easier when you start to build more complex environments. What if you want to have languages in different sites? I can add default gateway in here. And I can say default gateway again. If the machine has this default gateway, that machine is belonging to the Oslo side. And if it's this default gateway, it belongs to the Stockholm side. And for the Oslo side, we use NBNO, is it? Right? Assuming I have those language packs installed. I can't spell my own city. I don't live there, though. I just happen to work there. That's the difference. I have the office is in Stockholm. I've been there like 5 times this year. I travel a lot. But this is a way of assigning dynamic settings. And if I wanted to have Office installed, but only in Oslo, this is it. So you start combining all these rules together. And they will feed into the sequence, making deployment dynamic. Other things that you get, if you look into the sequence, when you start to add things to it, for example, you want to add components to it. You can add roles and features. For Windows 7, for 2008, 2008 R2, and for even 2003 servers that you want to have being deployed as part of your sequence. You can add in language packs online, or you can add in language packs offline, or updates offline. You can make this a domain controller, DNS, DHCP. You can even now run PowerShell scripts directly from the sequence. Just put the script name in there. That's it. They call their own provider now. These features are not enabled or available in plain vanilla ConfigMgr. They're only available once you add the integration to it. But these features are quite valuable. All right. So, a few things around boot images. I showed you most of the properties already, but you need to have 2. But you only use 1. Why do you need to have 2? Because PXE needs 2. Because a modern machine, when you start it, it will advertise itself as a 64-bit capable architecture, even if you deploy a 32-bit OS to it. So that's why we need to have the 64-bit boot image in there, because ConfigMgr in its infinite wisdom is getting those netboot files from the boot image. If you peek into the log file, you will actually see it says expanding Vim, and it will copy those 6 files into the 64-bit folder needed to do the PXE boot. So what you do in the console is the following. And you go to the ConfigMgr server first. You add 2 boot images. You don't use the default ones because they are missing ADO. They are missing HDA, all the fun things in life. So you create new boot images. And you do it using this wizard. That's the MDT-specific boot image that will add all the goodies that you need into the boot image. But you add 2 of them, a 32-bit and a 64-bit. This one you will also add drivers to. This one you never touch again. It's just there. Because even when you deploy 64-bit boot images, OS images, you should use the 32-bit one. Because that boot image can deploy everything. And it's much easier to maintain a single boot image than to maintain multiple. The rare exception could be that you are using ConfigMgr to deploy servers, and they are using different utilities to do the RAID configuration and firmware updates or TPM or BIOS things, and those are only available for a 64-bit OS or a 64-bit boot image, yeah, then you may need to have a 64-bit boot image. But that's about the only scenario I have seen. I use a single boot image for everything. Now, this is new, or somewhat new. UDI came with MDT 2010. It's basically as fearful or dangerous as it may sound. It's allowing users to select things during a deployment. For example, allowing the user to select what applications they should have. I know it tears your heart apart, because that's your job as an IT pro to select things. But the world is changing just a little bit. Users are getting used to be able to select things. And this is the feature that enables that, even during a deployment. It's a complete rewrite, so even if you tried the previous version and didn't like it, check this one out, because there is quite much changed. So, how does this look? I like this client, I do. I will close it, open it again. When you install MDT, you get the UDI designer in the start menu. UDI now supports all scenarios: bare metal, refresh, and replace. It even supports offline media. It has a single configuration file from the MDT files package. It doesn't use a web service anymore. Microsoft figured out it was a bit overhead to create a database, to create a web service, to store a 5 kilobyte XML file. So now they just have an XML file. But this is the scenarios you can see. And as you can see on the left pane here, you have a page library. And if you are sort of a coder or coder savvy, you can add your own ones in here. The previous version was not extendable. This one is. It's code involved, but you can extend it. You can add your own pages. So by default, you have a list of 10 pages here. For example, you have a page that will verify things when you start the deployment, that you actually run on power and you're not connected to a wireless network. You have selective applications. You create a list of ConfigMgr applications, assign this to the wizard, and now a user can select applications. And you can pre-select a few of them, and you can have users select additional ones. So you can have mandatory selections or user-based selections. You can do BitLocker configuration. Allowing a user to specify a pin, for example, or a technician to specify a pin. Language settings. This one is cool. Heard of user device affinity? New thing in ConfigMgr 12. Allows us to target applications to users. How will that work in ConfigMgr 7? If we target Acrobat Reader to a user. When is Acrobat Reader installed? Well, after the OS is deployed, the user logs in, and then they will spend 3 hours waiting for all the user-based applications to come over the network and being installed, so they can't use the machine for 3 hours. And they're not very happy about that. In ConfigMgr 12, when we hit F12 and start the deployment, we can ask, what user is supposed to have this machine? Well, it's me. All right. Then the sequence will make sure to preload all those apps during deployment, rather than 3 hours after deployment. So this is a way for us to select the primary user for this machine and make sure my apps are being deployed as well. Pretty neat. So UDI, quite nice. The thing that you need to do to get it to work when you create your sequences, you need to select the UDI template. There is a specific sequence for UDI, which will add all the UDI things to it. So you can see it's adding even more things to it. The cool thing about this designer, once you have configured your panes, you can actually do a preview. You can have it rendering a preview, and that will take some time here, but it's rendering a preview, and you can do the wizard here and see how it will look for an end user if they were about to do this. This is in my office on Acrobat Reader applications. All right. Now, by adding MDT into the picture, we have additional ways of very easily add scripting logic, database logic, web services to apply settings to our deployments. Because once you have the base ConfigMgr OSD up and running, much of your work is involved making sure settings are being applied to computers when they are deployed. And again, settings are what applications are supposed to be installed on that machine. What computer name should it have? How should that computer name be generated? What OU should it be added to an Active Directory? What domain is it supposed to join? What language is it supposed to have? What screen resolution is it supposed to have that machine when you deploy it? And all those settings can be set throughout the combination, one, more, or all of these items that you have on the screen here. Yes, sir. So the question was, if I have one application being targeted per device, per computer, and I have the same application being targeted per user, it will not be installed twice. ConfigMgr 12 has a very new and very efficient logic to make sure it doesn't try to reinstall applications, something that ConfigMgr 7 could do if you sort of forced it. Did I answer the question? Okay, so the follow-up comment was, what if I have an application that I deploy per computer to that sequence and have the same application with a different deployment type targeted per user, right? In that sense, ConfigMgr, when you deploy applications through a sequence, it will only pick one deployment type. So it will only pick the first one in this case, whatever that is, for that application. So basically, applications that you target through sequence, you normally only have one deployment type for. But it won't reinstall it twice. Did it make any clearer? feel free to come up and I can show you after the session here. So we use this to apply settings. And when you install MDT, you get the workbench, which you don't use. But you use it for one thing, and that's creating the database. Because once you have that database, you can start adding machines to it. And for every machine that you add, you can apply a rich number of deployment-related settings to it. Things like these items. Things like regional settings and such that you want to have. You can also create roles. Roles is a grouping of settings. So I have a role for the accounting department, and I can say for the accounting department, the following settings should be used. This OU. And then I can assign one or more roles to a given computer, making it very easy to assign settings. I can do that with location as well. I can create a location for Oslo and add a gateway in here. And then I can have settings for Oslo, time zone name, packages, applications, ConfigMgr packages I can add. I can even add ConfigMgr 12 apps into this list. I hate this user interface. I don't like it. There are better. I don't want to have to give this to help desk. On CodePlex, there is a front end that you can download. It's written by my Coster, a fellow from Germany. They're running it in production right now. It's currently being upgraded for 0.12 to fully support all features in it, but it still works, the 0.7 version. This is just a web portal to the same information. And it's totally free. And the thing here is that you can define what a given person or group is about to see in this UI. If you give them the workbench, they will see everything. They will see the list of those 100 settings, even if helpdesk normally assigns 8 of them. Now you can predefine and say, if Johan logs in, give him those 8. So you have role-based access in this one. You can define different permissions, assign different fields to different people in the organization. And it's total free to use. I think this is a better, richer interface than to use the workbench. Because, for example, if I work with roles, I can browse for packages in here. I can search for them. When I add them into the workbench, I have to type them in. I have to know the name. I have to know the package ID or program name if I'm using packages still. So I'm waiting now eagerly for the new version that fully supports 0.12. But so far, this one works fine, except for assigning apps. I have to type them in still. Yeah. Yes? So the question was, is the OSD computer name still missing? It says computer name in here. So it will still be used even though it's a legacy attribute and it's not supposed to be used. It will still work. But you can actually add in fields here as well. You can add additional fields. But I think Costa will fix that into the next release as well. But it's a known issue. But assigning computer names in here works. Just as the OSD computer name variable is not specified. Other things you may want to do is go beyond UDI, go beyond the database. And you can add settings through custom portals that you create. Now I want to go to my client and I can't find it. Great. The cool thing about all the settings that we have in MDT is that if we do that integration, we can simulate the deployment in 3 seconds flat by simply running a script. The CDI gather script, I call it from a batch file. I can start the deployment, and I will see directly on the output here, and I will also get a log file, what would happen if I deploy this machine. Should open it up in trace, wherever I put it. CM trace it's called now. If I deploy this machine, what setting should it get? What applications should it get? What names should it get? What properties do I have available to me? What kind of hardware is this? Is it a laptop, desktop, or server? Is it running on battery? All these things that I can use to do dynamic deployments is available to me right here. This is not a guarantee that the real deployment will work, but if you don't get your settings here, if you don't get the computer name right here, or the OU right here, or the application list right here, it will never work in a real deployment either. So this allows you to cut down on the development time by running the simulation first and then do the real deployment. You can also create custom front ends. That will allow you to do things, for example, by executing web services in the background. That will call and reach out into Active Directory, into the database, into ConfigMgr, and provide me with information I normally don't have on a client. I'm starting this now on a Windows 7 box. This is not how I normally start it. This is something I normally start on my boot image. But this is a way easier for me to start it. But as you can see, it's the same information. It's reading those 3 fields from the database. If I change them, it will update them. It's reading the role from the database. It's reading the OUs directly from Active Directory. And it gives me a list of my collections in ConfigMgr to which I have advertised OS deployment sequences. If I click Finish, it will call a web service that will add the machine to that collection and go. Things that you would normally do on the server side by doing custom HTAs and scripts, you do it on the client side. This is the light touch wizard that I'm using together with ConfigMgr. They work together. It's just an HTA. It's just a script. I'm just using the framework that you get when you do the integration to do additional changes, customizations, which is pretty neat. Yeah. PowerShell support, well, for WinP, only in version 4, and ConfigMgr 12 doesn't support version 4. The PowerShell support in the sequence is for the running OS only. And then it's for XP and above. So I'm sorry, we'll have to wait into a service pack or an R2 release of ConfigMgr until we get support for PowerShell in WinP. Because WinP will not be available until this fall, the full release. It's part of Windows 8. Before I leave you, a few final notes on drivers. I don't like the default way in ConfigMgr, the way it handles drivers, because it's using plug-and-play ID detection. I call that scenario total chaos, because that's exactly what it is. I prefer to use something called apply driver packages instead. I like to be in control. So let me just show you that. In my console, I do import packages in drivers. I didn't do that in ConfigMgr 7, but they kind of want that right now, so I started to sort of import them anyway. So I import my drivers, and I divide them into OS families so I can keep track of them. But during the import, I will add them to different packages. So I have a package for each and every model that I have. And I have pinpointed and said, I want those drivers for for that model. I take that work up front, those extra 10 or 15 minutes per model, and assign those drivers. Because then I know when I deploy that machine, that's exactly the drivers that are going in there. And to make this work in the sequence, I will edit it. I will find the auto apply driver step. I will disable it. I will add a new group, call it drivers, and I will start pour in all those packages. I will select my package, give it a name, and I would assign a condition to it. Only apply this package is if the following condition is true. Like that. But I have to spell it correctly though. And then I take this package, copy and paste, select the next one, change the name, change the condition, and I continue to do that until I've added 25 or 30 packages or whatever I have for my deployment of Windows 7 64-bit right now. This is the way I recommend to deal with drivers. It's a little bit more work up front, but you are in control, and you will probably thank me at some point in time later on. Here are links to all the stuff I've been showing you earlier today. All the scripts, code samples, it's available here on these links. This session is recorded, so you will have them available. I saw that sessions from yesterday were already being posted, so I expect that most of these sessions today will be added later on tonight as well. So thank you for taking your time. Have a great night.